series about the life, the works of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson. And the reason why we're talking about him today is because 74 years ago, yesterday, 10th day of the month of Shvat, the previous Rebbe passed away at the age of 70, close to 70. And if we had to go through his biography, it's like 3 volumes, 3 thick volumes. He had one of the most productive and chaotic lives of anyone in the 20th century. So we'll talk a little bit about his life, and very briefly, and then we'll also give a synopsis of his last discourse. Let me explain the background to it. When the previous Rebbe came to America, he came physically shattered. He was in a wheelchair, his speech was impaired, but that didn't deter him. And he would still speak and give addresses. Some were more about current events, about the Holocaust, about the needs of the Jewish community, Hasidic history, Hasidic lore. But then he would also deliver Hasidic discourses, which were pure Hasidic philosophical ideas. Most of them were very, very deep. And then when he became a little bit more impaired and he couldn't speak and deliver these discourses, he would publish earlier discourses that were not available. And every holiday, they would give out one of his or several of his discourses pertaining to that holiday that he said in earlier years. The one who would prepare it for publication was none other than his son-in-law, who succeeded him as the Rebbe after he passed away. And he also would issue a discourse not just for holidays, but also for a yahrzeit, the anniversary of the passing of one of his relatives. So he had a grandmother, Rebbitzin Rivka was her name, a very special woman who passed away on the 10th day of Shvat. So he issued a discourse to be studied on that day, and that's the day that he passed away. But when people studied that discourse, they realized that it was not just about his grandmother, it was about himself. A lot of hints about this is his final discourse. This discourse became known by the opening words, Basi Ligani. Those are biblical words from the Song of Songs, and I'll explain later when we get into the discourse. And when the Rebbe accepted the leadership, exactly a year later, he delivered a discourse on the previous Rebbe's discourse, chapter 1. The next year, he delivered a discourse on the previous Rebbe's discourse, chapter 2. And there's a total of 20 chapters, so he gave 20 discourses every year on another chapter, elaborating on and going deeper into it. And then after the 20 years, he started the second cycle. So this became known as the series of Basi Ligani. And to date, 2 volumes have been published, just these discourses that were said on this day for 40 consecutive years. So we'll go into that a little bit later. Let me just talk a little bit about the previous Rebbe. The previous Rebbe was the only son of his parents, Rabbi Shalom Dov Ber, who was the 5th leader of the Chabad movement. And Rabbi Shalom Dov Ber was known among all the other Chabad leaders as the most systematic thinker of Hasidic philosophy. One of the elder Hasidim referred to him as the Rambam, the Maimonides of Hasidus. Maimonides' uniqueness is his order, his way of systemizing all of Jewish law in a very clear, very lucid manner. And his father was likewise in that league. Now, even though Chabad Rebbes were primarily spiritual leaders who taught the deeper secrets of the Torah to the masses, they were also intimately involved in the goings-on in the Jewish world and behind the scenes, and sometimes not so much behind the scenes, they fought to protect Jewish interests, prevent pogroms, and likewise contribute to the welfare of the Jewish people in the Pale of Settlement in Russia and other parts of Europe. The Rebbe Rashab, as he's called, Rabbi Shalom Ber, that's an acronym for his name, was the father in 1880. He and his wife, Rebbitzin Schneersohn, who was herself a very unique and special woman, gave birth to a little baby boy that was going to be their only child. And they named him Yosef Yitzchak after a maternal grandfather. And this Yosef Yitzchak was born at a very pivotal time because he lived through every unimaginable crisis that affected the Jewish people. First under the Tsarist regime, then under the communist regime, and then under Nazi Hitler. He escaped all three horrific historical phenomena. Who would believe that a young scholarly man who grew up in a tiny cloistered shtetl in Belarus, the town of Lubavitch, combined with Tokyo, had the largest population in the world. The problem is that without Tokyo, it probably had a few hundred residents. It was a little shtetl in the tradition of shtetls in Europe that were very insignificant geographically. So who would have imagined that a young man, scholar, growing up in this little shtetl should arouse the ire of the communist regime and label him one of the greatest threats to the Soviet Union, and that a major counter-revolutionary crime was named after him. One of the major crimes in the Soviet Union was being a Schneersonsky. Anyone who was affiliated with Schneerson was considered to be a lethal force that would undermine the whole communist regime. I just want to share a little cute anecdote. 50 years ago, I was in Syracuse, and speaking for a group of students in the Syracuse University, and they were sharing with me that one of the students, that he and a few other students were going to visit the Soviet Union. This is before Soviet Union collapsed. And the student told me that one of the boys in the group who applied for a visa was named Schneerson. He was probably a very distant relative of the Rebbe. So I said, you know what? I guarantee you, Schneerson will not get a visa. He said, come on, don't be foolish. Of course, why not? He's a student. I said, mark my words, he's not going to get the visa. Sure enough, a few weeks later, I got a call from someone in Syracuse. All the other students got a visa to visit the Soviet Union except for Schneerson. The records of the KGB were released once the Soviet Union collapsed, and there were dozens of Hasidim who spent time in the paradise, the Gulag, and their files were revealed, and the crime, Schneersonsky. So that was an actual title of a crime. So who would have imagined that some young scholar from a little shtetl would undermine the Soviet Union? You know what? They were 100% right. He did undermine the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union ultimately collapsed. And our Rebbe would tell us that it was because of the previous Rebbe's fighting. You know, sometimes you can hit a wall and nothing happens, but you don't realize that you weakened the whole foundation of that wall, and weeks or months or years later, the wall will collapse. But it's the first blow that causes it to collapse. Anyhow, the previous Rebbe is referred to, it's a little bit of a dilemma. How do you refer to a Rebbe who's deceased? If you call him the Rebbe, then you're confused with the Rebbe who succeeds him. So Hasidim coined the term the previous Rebbe. Our Rebbe never used that term. Whenever he would speak about his father-in-law, he would say, the Rebbe, my father-in-law, the Nasi, the leader. That's how we would refer to his father-in-law. To him, he was the only Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, that we refer to as the previous Rebbe, who was, as we'll see, a fearless fighter and defender of Jews and Judaism. He was born on the 12th day of Tammuz in 1880 in the little town of Lubavitch. Actually, I think he was born in another town nearby, but that's where he lived. And he was raised by a father who introduced him to the idea of leadership. What is a definition of a Jewish leader? A Jewish leader is not some political hack elected to a position because he campaigned for it. A Jewish leader is someone who feels that the needs of the Jewish people are his needs, and he will do everything, including giving his life, to protect and defend and secure the Jewish people, whoever they may be, and whatever denomination of Judaism, whatever level of Judaism. A leader is for every Jew, unequivocally. When he was 11 years old, he started writing a diary that he wrote to the rest of his life, a voluminous diary. He was a prolific writer. And in his diary, he tells the story of when he was 11 years old, how he fought with a Russian policeman who was arresting a Jew. It's a whole long story how this Jew had a calf that he was going to sell, and the calf was stolen in town, and the policeman accused the Jew and started to arrest him. And the previous Rebbe, 11-year-old kid, goes over to the policeman and starts to wrestle with him. Of course, he was no match, and he was arrested, and he was in jail for that night. It's a very, very beautiful story, how he was ready to fight the authorities at the age of 11. When he was 15 years old, his father appointed him as his personal secretary, his aide. And wherever his father had to do something with regard to Jewish interests, the previous Rebbe's father would send him, a 15-year-old boy, to be his emissary and to advocate on his behalf. There was one occasion I remember reading where he sent an elder, a senior chassid, a very distinguished rabbi in his own right, to be, to give support to the previous Rebbe who was a kid. But he told this old chassid, "Do whatever my son tells you. If he says one thing, you have to follow what he says." In other words, the Rebbe put more trust in his 15-year-old kid than he did in a venerable, seasoned rabbi who was known for his sagacity, his brilliance, and his knowledge. At the age of 17, he married his wife, Nechama Dina, who passed away, I believe, in 1991. 17 was considered old in those days in the Hasidic community. And in the week of his Sheva Brachas, the 7 days that you celebrate the wedding, the previous Rebbe's father established a yeshiva, a Chabad school, which he said was designated to be a force that would fight the enemies of God and the enemies of Mashiach. And he referred to the students as Chayale Beis David, the soldiers of the house of David. You are going to be soldiers and you will fight. This is before the Soviet Union collapsed. This is in 1897. And people couldn't understand what he's talking about. Okay, they had problems with the Tsar, there were pogroms, and things were terrible under the Tsar. But no one could have imagined how bad things would become when the communists took over. And that's why it's puzzling to me how Jews have some Jews have sympathy towards communism. Communism, other than Nazism, is the most evil ideology in all of the history of humankind. They murdered more people than anyone else. And their main target was religion, and within religion, their main target was Judaism. But this is what the yeshiva students, and indeed, this is what happened. The graduates of this yeshiva, and there were very select few that were admitted into the yeshiva. They could only take a certain number, and they were very, very highly selective. Why? Because these were not just ordinary students who will be scholars. There were many yeshivas in Europe in those days. In Lithuania in particular, produced massive Torah scholars. But this was not just to produce scholars. They did produce scholars. This is produce soldiers. And who was the one who was running it? The Rebbe Rashab was the founder of it, but he chose his son, Yosef Yitzchak, the 17-year-old boy who just got married, to be the director. And he was really a very, very powerful leader. He wasn't just a pushover. It was very hard to get in. There are a lot of stories that maybe if I have time later, I can share with you some stories about some of the students that were not allowed in. In 1901, he was 21 years old. He campaigned for an establishment of a textile factory in another town called Dubrovna to improve the economic status of Jews in Russia, where 2,000 Jews were employed. So here he's not only fighting against the pogroms, he's trying to establish means of earning a living and being supported. This is at the age of 21. And he was sent many times to St. Petersburg and Moscow on behalf of Russian Jewry. In 1904, when you have the Russo-Japanese War, he spearheaded his father's campaign to provide Jewish soldiers on the Far East with matzahs for Pesach. And in the wake of the war, there were pogroms that swept the Pale of Settlement. And his father sent him to Germany and Holland, successful in obtaining the intercession of prominent statesmen on behalf of Russian Jewry. And I could go on a whole list, a litany of things that he did traveling all over Europe and representing his father for the welfare of the Jewish people. And the Tsarist regime was not so happy with his efforts. Yes?
I just, for my own understanding, the Alter Rebbe who authored the Tanya was the previous Rebbe's father?
No. The Alter Rebbe was the previous Rebbe's great-great-great-grandfather. It's 6 generations. The Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak's father was Rabbi Shalom Dovber, whose father was Rabbi Shmuel, whose father was Rabbi Menachem Mendel, whose father-in-law was Rabbi Dovber, whose father was the Alter Rebbe. So it goes back many, many generations. So he was arrested by the Tsarist regime on 4 occasions. So here you have a young man whose whole career as a young man was fighting. He was a fighter. He was a warrior. If you ever read his writings, you would think this man was the softest person in the world. To everyone he wrote, he would write, "Yedidi, my friend." And you felt that he was your friend. He was just so soft and so warm and so emotional. When he would pray on Rosh Hashanah, they would find the floor drenched with tears. He was an extremely emotional person, but he was also a very, very powerful leader, and he's paid dearly for his leadership. He was arrested several times by the Tsarist regime, and then in 1920, his father passes away, and he assumed the leadership reluctantly of Chabad with the passing of his father. His father, this was after the communist takeover, said, "I cannot tolerate these people. I don't want to be here." In other words, he insinuated that he would want to pass away rather than be together with the communists. He just couldn't stomach the evil that was represented by the communists. And shortly after he said that, he became ill. He contracted typhus, and a few days later he was gone. And he's buried in the city of Rostov in Russia. 20 plus years later, during the Holocaust, with the Germans coming, they decided to move his grave to another place so it shouldn't be desecrated, and his body and the shrouds and everything were totally intact. That's the previous Rebbe's father. And now the previous Rebbe is inheriting the role of leader, all by himself, fighting the communist regime. And then he himself also develops typhus and was on the verge of death. And miraculously he recovered. This is in the very few months of his leadership. And then he started a movement to establish schools for children in the Soviet Union. Secret schools, underground schools. I don't know how long it took for him to do this, but I heard from an expert on the history that he established about 600 underground schools for children. And he said, I'm willing to neglect all the other Jewish interests, but not Jewish education for children. The communists had the opposite view. They didn't see eye to eye yet, if you didn't guess. The communists said, we don't mind if a few old geezers go to the synagogue and worship their God, that the communists, of course, laughed at. They're going to die soon, and with them, Judaism will die. But children, they belong to us. They belong to us. My father-in-law, of blessed memory, was almost arrested because he gave some candy to a child and he made a bracha with him, a blessing. And when that was discovered, he was a criminal. And it's a miracle that he wasn't arrested. He was summoned to the KGB and is interrogated, and that's a whole other story. That's my father-in-law, of blessed memory. But the biggest problem in communist Russia was not the communist government per se, but the Jewish Communist Party, the Obsektia. The Obsektia is the Jewish section of the Communist Party. Jews, some of them are my best friends are Jews, so don't get me wrong. I like Jews. But when Jews get into something, they become the best or the strongest, whether it's good or bad. When Jews took over the ideology of communism, they really believed in it. You know, it reminds me of the story, the guy comes running to the rabbi and says, Rabbi, my son went crazy. He says, what happens? He only eats kosher and he keeps Shabbos. He says, I do the same things. Rabbi, you get paid for it. He really means it. So the communist leaders didn't really believe in communism. They believed in power. This was their way to get power. But the Jewish communists really believed in it. And they were willing to murder. And they undermined every effort at keeping Judaism alive, arresting hundreds, maybe thousands of Hasidim especially, because the only ones who were really fighting the communist regime were the Hasidic followers, because they had a leader who was urging them to do this. So, of course, it didn't take that long. It's in 1927, the previous Rebbe was arrested for the last time. This was his 7th arrest. So he was arrested before that by the communists and before that by the Tsarist regime. And one of his arrests, not the last one, he refused to cooperate with them. So they took out a gun and they said, this little toy has made many people speak. Many people would talk with it because of this little toy. He says, this toy could frighten someone who has many gods and one world. I have one God and I have 2 worlds. I'm not afraid of this. And they put the gun down. But the last time he was arrested was the worst of all, because who arrested him? 2 Jews. One was named Nachmanson, one was Lulav. One of them was a grandson of a chassid of the Rebbe's grandfather. That was the irony over here. And they interrogated him. They searched his apartment for all sorts of illegal material. The previous Rebbe's daughter was engaged to the Rebbe at that time. And she looked out of the window, and the Rebbe was there. This is late at night, about 11, 12, 1 in the morning. And she said, we have guests. When the Rebbe heard that, he realized that when someone tells you they have guests, that means you have unwanted guests. And he quickly ran to the house of the secretary of the Rebbe, a man by the name of Chaim Lieberman, and they got rid of all the incriminating evidence. What do you mean by incriminating evidence? Letters from overseas of support for the previous Rebbe's activities. That was part of the charges against him, that he's enlisting the support of all sorts of counter-revolutionary sources, the Western world, and that was life-saving. So anyhow, he was interrogated in his house, and he was taken to prison. The plan was for him to be shot that night or that morning. That was the plan. But the Rebbe, he was a little bit confused, took the wrong hallway to another department, and that saved his life for that night. And then he was taken, he was beaten, he demanded that he has his tefillin, and he took his tefillin with him, and he was climbing the stairs to go to his cell. And he knew that they're going to take it away from him, so he put on his tefillin. It was already in the morning. He put on his tefillin, and the guard behind him noticed it, and he threw him down a few flights of stairs. and he was stabbed by his belt in the process, and this caused him tremendous amount of pain and suffering physically. And he was in the cell for a few days. Actually, it was more than a few weeks. He was in the 15th of Sivan, and then he went until the 3rd of Tammuz. So that's a little over 2 weeks that he was in prison. And initially, he was sentenced to death by a firing squad. And that was commuted to 10 years of slave labor, and that was commuted to 3 years of exile in a city called Kostroma. Max, I'm sure, knows or heard of it, Kostroma.
Yes, I was here.
You were there, okay. But not in prison, not as a prisoner.
Got his concert.
Okay, the previous Rebbe was not asked to have a concert. But you know what he did? The first thing he did before he, well, let me just explain another part of it. He was released on Thursday, and he was told that he's going on a train to Kostroma. And he said, well, when am I getting there? And they said, on Shabbos. He says, I'm not going. Said, you're not going there, you don't go out of prison. He says, so be it. Now, Jewish law would have certainly allowed him to go on the train on Shabbos. He wasn't driving the train, first of all. Second of all, this is life and death. Staying another day in prison could have meant that they could have reversed the reversal. They could have put him in front of a firing squad. But the reason why he refused to go on Shabbos is because he felt, this is how the Rebbe explained it, he felt that the communist regime would advertise, your Rebbe, the holy man who says he's devoted to Judaism, he drove on Shabbos, he violated the Shabbos. So you can do the same thing. That would have demoralized all the Jews that were being supported emotionally and spiritually by the Rebbe. So he refused to go, even though he would be permitted by Jewish law. So he stayed an extra few days in jail. He was finally released on the 3rd day of Tammuz, traveled to Kostroma, but before he got to Kostroma, he sent one of his Hasidim there to make sure the mikveh was in order. He was in prison because he was building mikvahs. One of my close classmate, Shalom Jacobson, blessed memory, had a father who would go from town to town. He forged documents from Moscow ordering the mayor to build the mikveh or to refurbish the mikveh. So he built mikvahs all over the Soviet Union until they discovered the ruse that it was a forgery, and they, of course, plugged the mikveh with cement. There was a chassid who lived in, I think he was Georgia or Uzbekistan, one of those regions, and he had a mikveh in his house. Now, in those countries, Georgia and Uzbekistan, those were Muslim countries, and the communists were not as militant there as they were in the European parts of Russia. So this chassid, I remember seeing him, when he came out of Russia, he came to Brooklyn. He had a mikveh in his house. The authorities were afraid to close down the mikveh based on a religious persecution rationale. So they said, this mikveh is unsanitary, it's not safe. They're protecting people. So this chassid, Rabbi Raphael was his name, took a glass, put it in the mikveh, made a blessing, and drank it. He says, not safe, I would even drink this water. I'm sure he would not drink that water under any other circumstances. And they didn't touch the mikveh. The mikveh was protected for a while. So all these activities were under the direction of the previous Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak. And when he was finally released, he was forced to leave the Soviet Union. And he refused to leave unless he could take his library with him. Now, a library, how many books does a person have in a library in Russia? 5 books, 10 books, 100 books, 1,000 books? He had 30,000. He was an avid collector of Judaica. And he spent a lot of money on purchasing rare books that were in the first century of the printing house. There's a name for it, Incabula, I think, something like that. And he says, I'm not leaving unless I get every one of my books out. and they provided in the train for all of his library to go out. There was another library, his father's library, that still remains in Russia, that we're trying to get out, but Putin doesn't want to let it out. So he got his library out. Then he got his whole family out with him. His daughter was engaged to the Rebbe, our Rebbe. So they said, why do you need him? He's not your relative. He says, but he's engaged to my daughter. You can get another son-in-law. You don't have to take him. And the previous Rebbe said, there's no other son-in-law in the world like him. So, of course, the Rebbe was also allowed to go out of Russia. So where did he go? From Russia, he went to Riga, Latvia, and he established a Chabad center in Riga, Latvia. A few years later, he moved to Warsaw, Poland, and then to a suburb of Warsaw, Otwock. That was like a vacation area. And he established a network of schools all over Poland. Now, Poland was not a place where there was religious persecution, and it was a thriving place of Judaism. But he felt that there was something that the people there are missing, the Hasidic teachings, and he started a network of schools. Many of my teachers were from those schools. They're all deceased now, but they were all students of that network of schools. I'm going to ask okay, let me go on. Then, when the Nazis took over in 1939, my father, blessed memory, had just traveled to Poland to study in the yeshiva under the direction of the previous Rebbe. So he got there in August of 1939 in a suburb of Warsaw. As the war broke out, the American consulate told my father, don't worry, nothing is going to happen. The very day the World War II started. And of course, a few hours later, the bombing started. So my father had an audience with the previous Rebbe. And the previous Rebbe told my father and a few other students, every bullet has an address. You are not the address. You have nothing to worry about. And he had a lot to worry about, but if not for the blessing of the previous Rebbe, because on the train to Riga, they were going from Warsaw to Riga, a German plane started to strafe the train. And it was a Jewish soldier on the train, a Polish soldier, but he was Jewish. So he went on the top of the train to shoot at the German plane, and he was shot and killed on the spot. And then miraculously, a Polish plane arrived, and they got engaged in a dogfight with the German plane and shot down the German plane. Now that might have been the only time that happened in World War II. But that happened there, and my father's life was saved as a result of that blessing. But there's another thing. The Rebbe told my father and gave him a special mission that when he comes to Riga, he should go to a member of the parliament who was a Chassid, Mordechai Dubin, very holy Jew, that he should start the process of getting the Rebbe out of Europe. Because the previous Rebbe was a Latvian citizen. And that was the beginning of the salvation of the previous Rebbe. My father would always talk about it, that he had the schus, he had the merit, the privilege to be involved in the saving of the Rebbe. There's a lot to tell about how he got out of Poland. It's actually a very ironic story. It was through one of the leading Nazis. He was the head of the military intelligence. His name was Canaris, who was against Hitler. He was later on killed by Hitler because he had an assassination plot. But Canaris, apparently the American government, the way I understand it is Mordechai Dubin got in touch with the American government, and the American government got in touch with Canaris, and Canaris sent a soldier, a hero of World War I, whose father was Jewish, and Hitler gave him a dispensation. He was like an Aryan, honorary Aryan, and he sent him to Warsaw to get the Rebbe out. Now the Rebbe was hiding, obviously. And here a Nazi soldier comes to Warsaw and says, where does the Rebbe live? Which Jew in his right mind would tell him where the Rebbe lives? So it took him, I don't know how long, until he finally got the Rebbe, and he found him, and the Rebbe says, I'm not leaving unless I can take my whole family and all my entourage of people that were close people to him. And he says, how can I smuggle everyone out? So the Rebbe said, I'm not leaving. But he had orders to get the Rebbe. So he took the Rebbe and his whole entourage, and they had to lie to the SS. The SS didn't get along with the military, with the German military. So they had to lie that these Jews were arrested and they were needed in Berlin they were going to Berlin under the auspices of the military. And miraculously, he got out to Berlin. And from Berlin, he was sent to, I don't remember if it was Riga or some other place, and then maybe Stockholm. And from there, he took a boat. I think it was the last boat to cross the Atlantic, and he got to America in 1940, around a few weeks before Purim. When he came to America, this was the second time he was in America. In 1929, the previous Rebbe visited Israel after he got out of Russia. He visited Israel, and he visited America. My grandfather had an audience with him, with my father, who was my father's bar mitzvah. And the Watkins Street Shul, one of the largest synagogues in America, and it was packed. You couldn't get in there, and the windows were open so people outside could hear. And my grandfather was outside. He was able to hear the Rebbe. This was 10 years earlier. Within those 10 years, the Rebbe's health deteriorated. He got a heart attack. He had MS, and everything else you can think of. One chassid once told me that the previous Rebbe suffered from almost every illness, including hemorrhoids. And I know what that feels like. But that's the smallest of the things. So he comes to America in a wheelchair, and he refuses to get off the boat until a yeshiva is established in Brooklyn that would be in the spirit of Chabad. Now, in those days, American Jewry, even the most orthodox, had a cliche: America is different. You can't expect American Jews to be like European Jews. And many people would quip that when Jews crossed the Atlantic, they would throw out their talis and tefillin into the ocean. I don't know if that means it was done literally, but figuratively. And the previous Rebbe says, no, it's not true. America is not different. And he, together with his son-in-law, who came a year later, escaped France a year later, a little over a year later, reversed the whole mentality, the whole mindset of America, that everything is different. When he came to America, he established a network of day schools, of Hebrew schools and day schools, including in Buffalo, I think in 1942, if I'm not mistaken. And then throughout the entire Northeast, as far as St. Louis and Chicago and Baltimore and every other part of the Northeast, he started a network of schools that would reverse the mindset and the attitude that America is different. He started other movements of helping Jews, especially in Russia. He was constantly collecting money to help the Jews in Russia, helping Jews during the Holocaust. He himself lost a daughter. The previous Rebbe had his youngest daughter and son-in-law were put to death in Treblinka, and other relatives as well. They perished in the Holocaust. So he was a victim of the Holocaust. He escaped Nazi Germany, and that didn't mean that he was now ready to take it easy. The previous Rebbe, according to one of his historians, estimated, based on the previous Rebbe's numbering of letters, that he wrote about 100,000 letters. 100,000 letters to Jewish leaders, to Jewish individuals, with blessings, with advice, with history. There's one letter that he wrote to his daughter, the Rebbe's wife, a 150-page letter containing Hasidic history. He also wrote a voluminous diary. We don't even have all of it published, but there'd probably be dozens of volumes. He also wrote about 30 volumes of Hasidic philosophy, and of all the Chabad Rebbes, his are the most abstract and the deepest teachings. But the funny thing is that he also wrote discourses for simple people. And he once said that those were the hardest for him to write. The simpler he made it required much more intellectual energy to be able to take deep concepts and present them in a way that even average people could understand them.
It's funny because isn't that very quality is what the Rebbe, our Rebbe, excelled at. He could distill
Right,
most
right.
complex
There are
things.
many parallels between the previous Rebbe and the Rebbe, and many differences. One of the differences is the previous Rebbe traveled all over Russia, all over Europe, all over America. Our Rebbe, when he became Rebbe, never left New York City, never left his study, never took a day off from working 14, 16, 18 hours, never, totally different approach. But he reached every part of the world regardless. So there are many differences between the Rebbe and the previous Rebbe. If you see pictures of the Rebbe sitting at the table with the previous Rebbe speaking, and you see the Rebbe sitting like a statue, he had such respect and reverence for his father-in-law that it's unbelievable. And the father-in-law had tremendous respect for his son-in-law. Once someone came to the previous Rebbe and asked him for advice, and the previous Rebbe gave him advice, and he says, "Speak to my son-in-law." And he spoke to the son-in-law, and the son-in-law gave him different advice. So he didn't know what to do. So he came back to the father-in-law, and he says, "I listened to you. You told me to go to your son-in-law, and he told me it's different, the opposite of what you said." He says, "Listen to him." So a few weeks before he passed away, he didn't leave a will. And there were two people who might have become candidates for this leadership: the Rebbe and his older brother-in-law, who was a noted Hasidic scholar, and he was one who was very involved in all of the previous Rebbe's activities. And he was older. He was 5 years older than the Rebbe. But a few weeks before he passed away, the previous Rebbe calls in one of the elder Hasidim, and he starts talking about his younger son-in-law, praising him, his brilliance, his mastery of all of the Talmud, of all of commentaries of all the Hasidic writings, and so on and so forth. And that was it. There was no other reason for him to call him in. That was just one of the many hints that he wanted his younger son-in-law to succeed him. Why he didn't say so openly in a will, we can speculate. Some say he didn't want to hurt the feelings of the older son-in-law, but he knew the Hasidim would realize who was really the one who was qualified. And then there's a story. The Rebbe's older brother-in-law he was respectful towards the Rebbe, but he didn't accept the Rebbe as his Rebbe. He was 5 years older. He was the senior son-in-law. Then once he had an issue, apparently it was a life and death issue, and he couldn't figure out what to do. So he decided to speak to the Rebbe, his brother-in-law. He knew he was a bright man, brilliant man. Maybe he can come up with advice. So the Rebbe says, "I don't have an answer either, but tomorrow I'm going to the gravesite of our father-in-law. I'll ask him." And the next day he came back with an answer. And the Rebbe's older brother-in-law says, "I know my brother-in-law is a man of truth. I couldn't do that. I couldn't communicate with my father-in-law. He must be the Rebbe." And he became a devoted follower of his younger brother-in-law. And I remember seeing him every Friday night. He would come down. He lived in 770 in the center of Chabad, and he would come down to the Beis HaMedrash, to the synagogue, and he would spend the rest of the night there studying the Rebbe's teachings. I used to see it all the time. What united both of the Rebbes, they were both teachers of Hasidic thought, and they spreading that knowledge as well as the knowledge of Judaism all over the world. Both of them were suffused with incredible love for every Jew. There's a story that there were Hasidim that were... I guess we're not going to do the discourse today. There's a story of in 1943, 1944, the Rebbe sees two students, And he says, would you like to hear a fresh words of inspiration from my father-in-law, the Rebbe? And he said, sure. He says, whenever people would come to 770, people who were not observant, Jews who were not observant, I showed them a lot of love, welcomed them, embraced them. And then some older rabbis scolded me and says, why are you doing that? These people know better. These people came from Europe, and they were religious in Europe, and now they abandoned Judaism. And by showing them love and acceptance, you're giving them the wrong message, that it's all right to abandon Judaism. And the Rebbe said, Rebbe admitted, I don't know, maybe what I'm doing is wrong. I feel I have to show them love, but they tell me I'm doing something wrong. So I decided I'll ask my father-in-law. So he asked his father-in-law, and the father-in-law says, look, God created the world in a way that a parent has a child, and he has infinite love for that child. Then he has another child, and he has infinite love for that child. There's room for the next child, and the third, and the fourth. And then a child is born deformed. Some type of illness, some type of deformity. As much as the parent loves every child, you show more love to that child. He says the same thing is true spiritually. When a person doesn't do the mitzvah, there's a spiritual deformity. And God, just like a parent, loves everyone, but loves that Jew even more. Showers even more love on that Jew. So you, my son-in-law, you be like God and show love to these people. That's a beautiful story that involves both of the Rebbes. And the hallmark of both of them were that they were fighters willing to die for the benefit and the welfare of all the Jewish people. Yes?
In our history, in the Torah, it mentions a number of times that Hashem does not want something brought in that's deformed. For sacrifice or for other things too.
Right, if you're a Kohen, you couldn't serve in the temple if you had a deformity. That's a totally different story. It's not that they were considered to be less of a Jew or we didn't like them, but in the service in the temple represented perfection. And physical perfection was a reflection of a spiritual perfection that you needed in the temple. That's where we can discuss it some other time in a deeper way of understanding that. But it's not because a human being who's deformed, the deformity is a deformity. But it doesn't mean you don't love that person. In fact, you love them even more because of their deformity, and you try to heal them. Okay, any other questions? Yes?
So, there's a lot of Hasidic sects, but only Chabad reaches out to the non...
That's mostly true, but things have been changing. But even the sects that were militantly against non-religious Jews, they're calling them Goyim. You're not even Jewish if you don't keep everything. They began to experience, unfortunately, some of their own young members dropping out. And all of a sudden, they started to realize, you know what? That's my child, my daughter, my son. I have to show them love. And then they started to realize, but you know what? What's the difference between my child and someone else's child? There was once a chassid, I'm not 100% which sect it was, I think it was Bell's, whose son, who was very critical of Chabad for their outreach, and he was vocal about it, until one day his own teenage son dropped out of Judaism and just left the house and didn't have any contact with his parents anymore. And one day, he's walking in the train station in Tel Aviv, and a Chabad student confronts him and says, would you like to put on tefillin? And he finally agrees, and the Chabad student sees that he knows how to put on film like he always did it. And he befriended him, and to make a long story short, after a few months, he came back to his parents, and he resumed being a chassid. And then the father was so grateful to the Rebbe, because the Rebbe sent these students to do this, and he realized that he used to criticize the Rebbe. He decided, I'm going to ask the Rebbe for forgiveness. I'm going to apologize. And he traveled to New York, and he told the Rebbe, thanked him for saving his son, saving his child. The Rebbe never took credit for anything. He always credited his father-in-law. So whenever he said, my father-in-law this, he was referring to himself. But he considered himself to be an extension of his father-in-law. So he says, for my father-in-law, every Jew is his only child. So in other words, you're happy because you're a child, but to the Rebbe, every Jew is his child. But so this particular sect, Belz, has started a movement within them to reach out to non-religious Jews. So there's some changes in the world, positive changes.
I remember seeing a wonderful video of someone with the Rebbe, and he said, I want to offer you a blessing. And the Rebbe says, do you understand what you are doing right now? And I was very captivated by that. I don't remember. Yeah.
I do remember there was a chassid who broke away from Chabad. He started the renewal movement, Zalman Schachter. Some of you may have heard of him. Very dynamic, very charismatic person who always considered himself a chassid of the Rebbe, even though he wasn't totally observant. He was a Kohen, and he came to the Rebbe once, and the Rebbe asked him to bless him, because he's a Kohen, so he had the power to bless. Okay? Everyone have a good day. So today we celebrate, because this is when the Rebbe accepted the leadership. It was a year later, but it was the night of the 11th of Shvat, which is today. And today is also the birthday of my daughter, Chaya Sarah. And we were listening to a hookup of the Rebbe. This was the night, last night, 45 years ago. And my wife was close to giving birth. So I had to be in the Chabad house. I was translating the Rebbe's talk. So we made up that if my wife feels she has to go to the hospital, she should call the operator, and the operator could get involved in the call. That would be the signal that she needs to go to the hospital. Sure enough, we're in the middle of listening to the Rebbe speak. The operator chimes in and says, there's an emergency call for Rabbi Greenberg from your wife. Will you accept the call? I said no, because I knew what the call was about. I had to leave. And the operator was shocked. But my wife explained that this was, that I didn't have to, she didn't have to speak to me. I knew what that phone call was about. And then she gave birth to a wonderful, beautiful daughter. Okay, everyone have a good week. Yes?
It's kind of an embarrassing question, but what exactly is a chassid?
Oh.
Like a student?
Do you have 6 hours? A chassid literally means a pious person, but it means someone who's permeated with a spirit of Judaism and is willing to go more than just the basics and going to go beyond in terms of their relationship with God, in terms of the relationship with other people, but it became used as a follower of a Hasidic rabbi. So even though he might be a nasty, good-for-nothing, but if he considers himself a follower, people will call him a chassid. There was a story of a real chassid, a real holy chassid, who was beaten up by a member of a so-called other Hasidic sect because he was spreading the teachings of Hasidus. And there was a court case. So the judge asks the violent criminal, "Are you a chassid?" He says, "Yes, I am." Then he asked the victim, who was really a holy Jew, he says, "Are you a chassid?" "I try." That's the difference between a real chassid and a fake one.
I'm not sure the question you asked him, but do you ever about the older Rebbe?